so important. So we've worked many years editing and dealing with authors, dealing with academic submissions, working with publishing companies. We see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of academic articles published in our journals, thousands upon thousands published every year in the Bentham science journals and ebooks, and we are therefore able to identify three common kinds of inadvertent, often academic plagiarism that authors submitting their work to journals fall foul of very often. Mosaic plagiarism, paraphrasing plagiarism, and what's known as self-plagiarism. In the first case, mosaic plagiarism, authors include various data from a range of different sources, different articles, different websites, no matter, mix them together in their own work and make it seem original without citing. That's the first kind of common academic plagiarism that we encounter. Paraphrasing plagiarism, the second kind. Words might differ. You might rephrase words from another academic article, but the idea remains the same, and therefore plagiarism has occurred. Citation, as you'll see in a minute, is necessary in this case as well. Self-plagiarism, of course, many academic authors around the world are unaware that this is even an issue. If you reuse or republish something from one of your own academic papers, you must cite yourself. You are stealing from yourself if you don't cite yourself, and of course this has to be done as well in academic publishing. Even if you're revisiting an old idea or a previously published observation, it's necessary to cite yourself. If I want to publish a paper that includes a picture or a figure or a graph from one of my previous publications, I can't just reuse it. I've got to cite myself. I've got to cite Dyke 94 or Dyke 2007, wherever the source of that original picture is from. Why? Because it's good practice to give your readers the sources, but also you might not own the copyright. And that's something else that authors are often unaware of in academic publishing as an ethical issue. So let's ask a few questions around academic plagiarism. Is it plagiarism if you cite the source when putting work into your own academic papers? The answer is no. If you correctly cite the source, then of course you do not commit plagiarism. However, the word correct is vital in this sentence. In order to avoid plagiarism, you must adhere to the guidelines of your citation style. So here are two examples, the APA or the MLA citation styles. And direct quotes, if you take information from another paper and you quote it directly into your article, you must attribute that source with 100% accuracy. If you have a question about this, maybe we can answer them at the end of this session today. But if in doubt, cite the work of other people, because if you cite the source, you will be okay. You will not be committing plagiarism. Taking work from somebody else is previously published work. Ask yourself this question. You're the member of an audience where research results are being presented. You use ideas described by one of the speakers in the design of your next research project. So you're sitting at a conference or a department talk or a talk at another university, and you hear some ideas presented in that talk, which you then go and use in your own work. That is plagiarism. It's unethical. You shouldn't do it. If you hear ideas at a conference or view results on somebody else's slide, you should ask their permission to talk about this in your own work. You can cite that conference abstract. You can cite personal communication, for example. That's best practice in this particular situation. Common, frequently asked questions about academic plagiarism. Here is another example. Is this plagiarism? You are reviewing a submitted manuscript for a journal, working as a peer reviewer, for example. You decide to use novel research methods described in that manuscript to enhance your own research. Can you take ideas, content from a paper that you're reviewing for a journal as a peer reviewer into your own work? No! This is one of the worst kinds of academic plagiarism because it has to be happening on purpose. This is unethical, breach of trust. As a peer reviewer, you have to wait for that paper to be published or at least appear on a preprint server so that you can appropriately cite it in your own work. So that's a question that we get asked a lot. Reviewers come to us having worked on papers, having peer-reviewed articles for our journals, and they ask us, I've just reviewed a paper, can I cite it in my own work? Not until it is online, at least on a preprint server, preferably fully published, to give those authors full credit for the work that they have done. Here's another frequently asked question. You're writing a paper in English, and let's imagine that your native language is not English, as I know many of the participants in this webinar today. When you're writing a review of the literature, you use another person's exact words because you are not confident about paraphrasing or synthesizing ideas into your own words in English. This is very common. This is inadvertent plagiarism. I do this myself in my second language. You read something, you think that sounds good. You use it, you internalize it, you end up using it in your own work in the future. And this is the most common ethical plagiarism related issue that academic publishers end up having to deal with. And this is why you should use plagiarism checking services before submission, as this is a way of preventing inadvertent plagiarism in your own work. We'll come back to that in a minute. Imagine, if you will, that you are doing research using the internet, online research. You choose to use ideas from a website in the design of your next research project, and you also use some quotes from that website in your literature review. Now, this is also important because, of course, more and more research is based on a variety of sources, not just online other peer-reviewed literature. You'll need to cite the online source and you'll need to note the date on which you access that content, because again, you'll get caught by a journal, as we'll talk about in a minute, if you don't. So even online data searches, even online information sources have to be correctly attributed, have to be correctly cited in your own work. Finally, self-plagiarism, as we talked about before. You are writing a manuscript for publication that's based on your own previous research. You decide to include some exact text or a figure or some data from one of your earlier manuscripts in the new one. What should you do? You should cite yourself. It's very, very important to do this, but often authors are unaware of this as an issue, as we've discussed before. Inadvertent plagiarism of text translated, embedded from a language that's not your native language, and self-plagiarism can trip up international researchers, can cause problems for international researchers when they submit work to international journals. Why? Because international journals like Bentham and Science, like the other international publishing companies that you'll know and love, they submit articles through plagiarism checking software services, plagiarism checking databases. Turnitin, Authenticate. We'll come back and we'll talk about these different sources in a minute. But of course, you don't want to get caught out by your publisher. So you are looking to do this probably, or you should be looking to do this before you submit to a journal. What's the acceptable percentage of a plagiarism report? Most journals are going to be looking for text similarity from a check less than 15%, but you would want to go really ideally for less than 10% in order to avoid rejection from that journal. And it happens all the time. We submit all of the papers that come into our journals through this kind of software. And if an author is scoring above 15%, then questions get raised by the editors as to whether the paper has been correctly attributed. Rejection can lead to blacklisting at a publisher. So it is a good idea to get your work checked before you make a submission. Here's what a plagiarism check looks like. You can see that the software scans through all the text. It compares the text online with a number of online databases, Web of Science, Scopus, those kinds of places, and it finds the references that the text comes from, and it gives a score, an originality score in each case. So this paper is okay because you can see the originality score is 10%. So this paper, the text in this article is judged to be appropriately attributed, appropriately cited to the correct source. But this case here, you can see an example, 32% similarity. The authors in this case have taken text from previously published articles and have not cited those articles appropriately. So this paper would get rejected before peer review by an academic journal. So bulletproof your work. Of course, inadvertent plagiarism can certainly happen. As we've talked about, if you read something in a second or third language and then without thinking, as I've done in the past in my second language, use it in your own writing. Consider, ladies and gentlemen, getting your documents evaluated by a plagiarism checking service before submission. Of course, it's also important to keep careful records of the sources that you use. EndNote, Mendeley, these are examples of reference management tools that many authors are using to keep track of where you read your sources so that you can cite them in your own articles. Journals and publishers check the addresses of authors on articles. They send papers for plagiarism checks before peer review. And as we've discussed, journals are looking for a less than 10% similarity with already published sources. Otherwise, they're going to be considered the work to be recycled. Thank you for the questions. I can see that people are asking questions about this. I'm going to keep going with the presentation and then we'll answer at the end. We'll have some time at the end of this session to address any of your questions, but keep them coming into the chat box because, of course, we will answer them at the end. So sources like Crossref, Scopus, software packages have negotiated access to different databases. Here are some examples of the main platforms and websites that journals use to check for plagiarism. Euphorus, Qtext, Authenticate, and Turnitin are the most famous, the most well-known of these platforms, as well as PlagScan and Plaggram. So I think many universities around the world are using Turnitin to check student essays, for example, for plagiarism. So people ask us, how can I avoid plagiarism in my own work?